I remember the first time I realized my life was about to change forever. It wasn't in a whispered warning or a quiet conversation, but in the sudden, piercing look from my Aunt Clarissa, one that made my chest tighten, as if my heart was trying to run away before I even understood why. She had always been magnetic in a way that unnerved me, confident, graceful, and impossibly composed. But that evening, in her living room, the air felt different. The clock ticked loudly, the shadows of her chandelier stretching across the walls like fingers, and I knew something in me had shifted without permission. She smiled, that soft, knowing smile that seemed to strip away any barrier I'd built between us. You have such delicate features, she said, almost as if testing me, as if my own reflection wasn't enough to convince me. I swallowed hard, trying to laugh it off, but the words lodged themselves in my throat. Delicate features. I'd never thought of myself that way, and yet, her gaze made it feel undeniable. It started small, almost innocuous. A suggestion here, a comment there. "You look lovely in pastel colors," she'd say as I reached for a plain hoodie. Or, "Your hands are so elegant. You should see them in a manicure," when I'd mindlessly rub my palms together out of nerves. And each time, a flicker of something strange and unsettling danced in my chest. Embarrassment, curiosity, a craving to see what she saw. One evening, after another subtle remark about my potential, she brought out a small box from her bedroom. I hesitated at the threshold, a knot of unease twisting in my stomach. Inside were ribbons, scarves, and soft, delicate fabrics that smelled faintly of her perfume, clean and intoxicating. "Try this," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "Just for me." I wanted to say no. I really did. But I felt the weight of her gaze pressing into me, and before I could reason it away, I found myself holding a pastel blouse, my hands trembling. There was something thrilling and terrifying about the idea of being watched so closely while stepping into an identity I had never imagined for myself. I slipped it on, awkwardly at first, the fabric soft against my skin, and looked at my reflection. The boy staring back seemed foreign, almost a stranger in the mirror, while the girl I was becoming lingered at the edges of the glass, delicate and unreal. "You look perfect," she whispered, and that single word echoed through me. Perfect. It was more than admiration. It was a subtle command wrapped in affection. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, to resist or surrender. And in that moment, I realized I was already halfway lost to her world, a world where I wasn't just me anymore, but someone she wanted me to be. From that night, nothing would ever be the same. Every glance, every small instruction, every carefully chosen accessory began to reshape not just my appearance, but the core of how I saw myself. I was entering a new reality where my reflection was a landscape I didn't recognize, and yet a part of me ached to explore it, to learn how to move through it, and to understand whether this version of myself could ever truly belong. The days that followed were like stepping into a slow, shifting dream. Aunt Clarissa had a way of turning ordinary moments into something almost ritualistic. Breakfasts weren't just meals. They were exercises in posture, voice, and subtle expressions. She would watch me over the rim of her teacup, tilting her head, her eyes assessing, and I felt as though every small gesture I made was being catalogued, studied, and gently corrected. At first, I fought it. My natural instincts rebelled, the casual slouch, the quick movements of my hands, the roughness of my speech, but each correction came with such patience, such care, that resistance became exhausting. I started to notice the way I adjusted my stance even before she said anything, the way my voice unconsciously softened when I thought she was nearby, the way my eyes searched for her approval like a lifeline. She began to involve me in small tasks that felt strangely intimate. Folding her delicate blouses, brushing her hair with careful, slow strokes, arranging her scarves by color and texture. Each task was innocent in appearance, but profoundly transformative in practice. My hands, once awkward and clumsy, began to mimic the elegance she displayed effortlessly. My reflection, once a stranger, gradually softened, shadows of a girl I didn't yet know forming in the mirror's glass. I caught myself staring longer, noticing the curve of my wrists, the slenderness of my fingers, the way certain fabrics felt like they belonged to me in a way that cotton t-shirts never had. And then came the clothing. Not just suggestions, but full outfits she picked out for me. I would walk into her room and find a neatly arranged ensemble on her bed, blouses with delicate collars, skirts that swished at my knees, cardigans in soft pastels, and she never asked me if I wanted to wear them. She simply said, "This is for you. Try it." And each time I did, my reflection surprised me. The boy I had been receded, and a girl, fragile yet undeniable, emerged, as if the mirror itself had been waiting for me to step into this identity. But with each step forward, a storm of emotions churned inside me. There was excitement, certainly, but also confusion and fear. What would my friends think? Could anyone understand this version of me? And yet, there was also a warmth, a sense of being seen in a way I had never experienced before. Aunt Clarissa didn't just dress me. She molded me, guided me, and somehow made me want to follow her instructions without question, even when they pushed me into corners of myself I didn't recognize. One evening, she led me to her bedroom with a quiet authority that left no room for protest. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting light and angles in ways that made the room feel endless. "Tonight, you'll learn how to carry yourself fully," she said, her voice low, steady, but commanding. I shivered as she handed me a delicate dress, its fabric soft as petals, and for the first time, I saw the enormity of what I was stepping into. I dressed slowly, meticulously, each layer tightening the connection between my outer appearance and the shifting landscape of my inner self. When I finally stood before the mirrors, I could hardly recognize the reflection. The curves, the posture, the subtle confidence that Aunt Clarissa seemed to instill in me, all of it combined into someone who felt foreign yet achingly real. I touched my cheek, traced my jawline, and realized I was beginning to inhabit this new version of myself, as if the girl in the mirror had been waiting all along for me to show up. But with this new self came vulnerability. I caught glimpses of doubt, flickers of old habits trying to claw back into my posture, my gestures, my voice. Each correction from Aunt Clarissa was gentle but firm, reminding me that transformation wasn't just about clothing, it was about stepping into every part of this identity, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how unnatural it initially felt. And somehow, with her guidance, I began to understand that becoming her perfect girl wasn't just about appearances. It was about allowing myself to feel, to explore, and to accept the version of me that had been hidden, even from myself. Days blurred into weeks, and the transformation began to feel less like an experiment and more like a new reality I was living inside. Every moment with Aunt Clarissa carried a quiet intensity, an unspoken test that I didn't realize I was passing. She didn't pressure me outright. Instead, she created situations where my own curiosity and desire to please her led me forward. Sometimes it was small, sitting with my legs crossed just so, holding my teacup with fingers curved elegantly, brushing my hair with more care than I thought possible, but each tiny adjustment felt monumental, as if the act itself rewired something deep inside me. The mirror became both a friend and a challenge. At first, I avoided long looks, fearing what I might see. But gradually, I lingered, studying the way shadows and light danced across my face, the way my hair framed my features differently when combed just so, the subtle shifts in my posture that made me feel like I was walking inside someone else's skin. And yet, even as I began to accept these changes, there was a persistent voice in the back of my mind, whispering doubt. Who am I really? Am I becoming myself, or just the person she wants me to be? The tension gnawed at me, and some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd lost the boy I once was, or if that boy had simply been waiting to be transformed all along. Social encounters became minefields of anxiety and revelation. Even casual walks outside were exercises in performance. I noticed the way people's eyes lingered differently, how my gestures were interpreted, how the world began to respond to me in ways that both terrified and exhilarated me. I learned to walk more lightly, to speak with more care, to anticipate reactions that never used to matter. Each interaction felt like a negotiation between who I had been, who I was becoming, and who Aunt Clarissa hoped I would become. One afternoon, she handed me a scarf, delicate and patterned, and asked me to drape it around my shoulders in a way that framed my face. My fingers fumbled, unsure of the exact folds, the right angles, the intended effect. She approached me silently, adjusting my stance, lifting my chin, guiding my hands without words. I felt a warmth spread through me, a mix of gratitude, embarrassment, and something more complicated, something like admiration tinged with longing. "You're learning faster than I imagined," she murmured, and the words, gentle as they were, sent a shiver down my spine. And yet, the transformation was not without struggle. Some days, I recoiled from the reflection in the mirror, wishing for the familiarity of my old self. Clothes that felt constrictive, hairstyles that didn't sit right, gestures that seemed exaggerated. I resisted them all, silently cursing myself for wanting the ease of my old life while simultaneously craving the elegance and refinement Aunt Clarissa cultivated in me. Every correction, every lesson, every gentle insistence pulled me closer to a version of myself that was both frightening and intoxicating. Then came the night that truly unsettled me. Aunt Clarissa arranged a small gathering with friends, insisting I accompany her. I felt naked under the scrutiny of unfamiliar eyes, every movement analyzed, every expression judged. My heart pounded as I navigated the room, aware of every glance and whisper, aware of the invisible thread connecting my performance to her expectations. And yet, when I caught her gaze across the room, there was a quiet affirmation, a reassurance that I was exactly where I needed to be. In that moment, I realized that her perfect girl wasn't just a role I played. It was a reflection of trust, of intimacy, of a bond that I couldn't articulate but felt in every fiber of my being. By the end of the night, exhaustion mingled with a strange exhilaration. I returned home, trembling, overwhelmed, and yet there was a new certainty in me. This was no longer just about clothes or posture. It was about understanding, confronting, and embracing a side of myself that had always been dormant. And as I fell asleep, tangled in the scarves and fabrics that had become extensions of my identity, I knew that the journey was only beginning, that the next steps would test me in ways I couldn't yet imagine, but that I was ready to face, one delicate, deliberate motion at a time. Weeks folded into months, and the lines between who I had been and who I was becoming blurred in ways that both terrified and fascinated me. Every day with Aunt Clarissa was a lesson in patience, observation, and subtle transformation. She didn't need to speak to teach me. A glance, a tilt of her head, or the way she adjusted her own posture could convey a lesson far more profound than words ever could. I began to notice nuances in my movements I'd never considered, how I crossed my legs, how my hands rested on the table, how my gaze could convey thoughtfulness without saying a single word. Each discovery was like stepping into a room I had never seen before, one that was at once foreign and achingly familiar. One morning, I awoke to find a new challenge waiting for me. Aunt Clarissa had laid out an entire outfit on her bed, something far more elaborate than anything I had worn before, a blouse with lace trimming, a skirt that flared softly at the knees, and a pair of delicate flats that pinched my feet in ways that made me acutely aware of every step. "Today we refine," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. I felt a rush of nervous energy, my stomach tightening, but I also felt a spark of anticipation, a flicker of curiosity that had grown impossible to ignore. Dressing in front of her mirrors was no longer just about clothing. It had become an act of self-examination, of confronting the subtle tremors of insecurity that rose to meet me every time I faced my reflection. I traced the contours of my face, the curves of my body, the way the skirt fell in soft folds over my legs, and I felt both exposed and alive. The girl in the mirror was emerging more fully, more confidently, yet I still wrestled with doubt, with the old habits of slouching, fidgeting, and turning away from the world. She watched me silently, then stepped forward, adjusting a curl that had fallen across my forehead and straightening my posture with a gentle, authoritative touch. "You are more capable than you realize," she said. And I felt it, not just her belief in me, but a growing, undeniable sense that I could inhabit this identity fully, not for her, but for myself. The tension inside me softened, replaced by a strange exhilaration, a recognition that I was discovering a part of myself I had never dared to acknowledge. The emotional intensity of this transformation wasn't confined to private moments. Even outside the home, the way I carried myself began to attract subtle attention. Strangers' glances lingered slightly longer, friends noticed changes in my demeanor, and I started to understand the power of presentation, of self-awareness, of inhabiting a space fully. And yet, every compliment, every subtle recognition, was a double-edged sword, sharpening the awareness that this new version of me existed in a delicate balance between acceptance and fear. One evening, Aunt Clarissa asked me to accompany her to a small gathering of close friends. She chose my outfit herself, a soft lavender dress that seemed to shimmer under the lights, paired with simple flats and a ribbon in my hair. As we entered the room, my heart hammered, my palms sweated, and for a brief moment I wanted to retreat, to dissolve into the familiar safety of anonymity. But then I felt her hand brush mine, guiding me forward, steadying me, and the tension in my chest eased just enough to take the first step. Every conversation, every movement, every laugh was a test I didn't know I was passing. I became aware of subtle shifts in my voice, gestures, and expressions, learning to inhabit the space fully while remaining true to the fragile girl emerging inside me. And though fear and doubt still lingered like shadows at the edges of my consciousness, a quiet sense of pride began to take root, a recognition that the girl I was becoming was not a facade, but a part of me that had been waiting for someone, for a moment, for the courage to emerge. By the time we returned home, exhaustion had given way to a quiet reflection. Standing in front of the mirrors once more, I studied the subtle grace in my movements, the newfound confidence that seemed to radiate from my reflection, and I understood, in a way I never had before, that this transformation was not just about appearance or approval. It was about self-discovery, trust, and the courage to step into a version of myself that had always been there, waiting to be fully seen. The transformation was no longer a series of isolated lessons. It had become the rhythm of my life. Every morning began with careful consideration. Every movement was measured. Every glance weighed. Aunt Clarissa's influence had seeped into the corners of my mind, shaping not only my appearance but the way I thought, the way I felt, and even the way I imagined myself in the world. Sometimes it felt like a delicate dance between freedom and guidance. I was learning to inhabit this new self, yet every step carried the echo of her expectations, soft but insistent. One afternoon, she introduced a new challenge that tested more than just my external appearance. "Today, we explore expression," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. She had set up a small corner of her living room with mirrors angled at different perspectives, chairs placed just so, and lighting that cast shadows with deliberate softness. "I want you to see yourself fully, from every angle, in every nuance," she explained. I felt a tight knot in my stomach, a mixture of anticipation and dread. Facing the reflection once was one thing. Facing it multiplied, observing every subtle shift, every twitch of doubt, was another entirely. As I moved through the exercises, imitating gestures, practicing the tilt of my head, the cadence of my voice, and the small elegance of hand movements, I became acutely aware of the layers of myself that had been dormant. My posture, once careless and unthinking, was now deliberate. My gaze, once evasive, sought connection even when it trembled with uncertainty. Every motion carried a tension between who I had been and who I was becoming, a tension that sometimes made me dizzy, but also made me feel alive in ways I had never imagined. Yet, with each passing day, the emotional toll grew. There were moments alone in my room when the mask slipped, when the careful cultivation of femininity felt heavy and isolating. I would catch my reflection and see a version of myself that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign, and a pang of longing for the simplicity of who I had been would strike sharply. But then, I would remember Aunt Clarissa's soft encouragements, her quiet confidence in me, and the sense of belonging to something larger than my own fear began to take hold. It was during one particularly quiet evening that she truly tested me. She asked me to prepare for an imaginary event, a scenario in which I would need to move and speak with poise under scrutiny, as though an entire audience were watching. I stood in front of the mirrors, trembling, adjusting the outfit she had chosen for me, a soft cream blouse tucked neatly into a skirt that swayed with each tentative step. My fingers fidgeted with the edges of the fabric, and for a moment, the old self, the boy I had been, resurfaced in silent resistance. But then she stepped closer, adjusted the line of my shoulders, and whispered, "You are enough. You already are who you need to be." Her words carried a gravity I could barely comprehend, yet they sank deep, untangling knots I hadn't realized were tied inside me. I began to move more freely, testing my balance, experimenting with expressions, letting the subtle strength of my reflection guide me. The girl I saw in the mirrors was no longer just a reflection of her desire or guidance. It was becoming my own. Each successful posture, each subtle smile, each measured step whispered a quiet affirmation that I could inhabit this new identity fully, without fear, without apology. And in that quiet room, surrounded by mirrors and shadows, I finally understood the core of my transformation. It wasn't about perfection, or about pleasing Aunt Clarissa, or even about escaping my past self. It was about discovery, about acknowledging a part of myself I had never allowed to breathe, to explore, to exist. For the first time, I felt a delicate, trembling kind of pride. A sense that I was no longer merely following instructions, but stepping into a truth that had always been there, waiting for me to claim it. By this point, the lines between who I had been and who I was becoming had all but vanished. Each day brought new lessons, small and large, and with them, a constant undercurrent of both excitement and fear. The reflection in the mirror had become my constant companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes challenging, but always demanding honesty. I could no longer pretend that this was a temporary experiment or a role I could step out of. The girl staring back at me was undeniable, and a part of me ached to fully embrace her. Aunt Clarissa's guidance had grown more nuanced, less overt, and far more powerful. She didn't need to instruct me explicitly anymore. Her presence alone directed me. A tilt of her head, a soft glance, a subtle adjustment of my own posture became enough to correct my hesitations, to guide me into the poise she encouraged. And yet, the subtlety of her influence only magnified the emotional stakes. Every time I faltered, even slightly, a small pang of self-reproach would ripple through me. Every success, every fleeting moment of elegance, brought a quiet thrill, a recognition that I was learning not just to imitate, but to truly inhabit. One evening, she asked me to prepare for a small, private gathering, a moment where I would need to embody the full grace and composure she had been teaching me. She had chosen a delicate outfit, a pale blue dress that seemed to glow under the soft lighting of her bedroom, paired with simple, elegant shoes. As I dressed, the weight of anticipation pressed on my chest. The mirror reflected every detail, the subtle curve of my waist, the softness of my hair, the gentle length of my fingers, and for the first time, I saw the totality of what I'd become. But alongside that awe came a tremor of fear. Who was I if the world saw me like this? Would I crumble under scrutiny, falter under expectation, or would I finally step into the person I had been cultivating in secret, in shadows, with trembling hands and a racing heart? Aunt Clarissa approached, her hands brushing lightly against my shoulders, grounding me. "You've grown more than you realize," she said softly, her eyes reflecting warmth and something deeper, pride, yes, but also trust. "This is your moment. Own it." I took a breath, letting the words sink in, and stepped toward the mirror. My reflection held a girl who was fully present, who moved with a grace I had once thought impossible, who carried the weight of transformation without collapsing under it. And for the first time, I felt a sense of alignment, a quiet harmony between my internal and external self. Every lesson, every correction, every night spent wrestling with doubt had led to this. As I navigated the room that evening, interacting with a small group of friends and family, I felt a mixture of nervous energy and exhilarating liberation. Eyes lingered longer than they used to, smiles were warmer, and I sensed, without needing affirmation, that I had stepped into a version of myself that was both authentic and fully realized. The girl I had become was no longer a shadow or a reflection of someone else's expectations. She was me, in a way that felt both fragile and unshakably strong. Later, standing alone in the quiet of Aunt Clarissa's room, I finally allowed myself to absorb the enormity of what had happened. I traced my reflection with trembling fingers, feeling the contours of a self I had once feared to explore. There was still vulnerability, yes, but it was tempered by a newfound confidence, a recognition that transformation was not about perfection or control, but about honesty, courage, and the willingness to fully inhabit the person you were meant to be. And in that silence, I understood that this journey was more than clothing, posture, or outward appearances. It was a journey into the heart of identity, of acceptance, of trust, and of love for oneself, for those who guide us, and for the fragile, luminous self that emerges when we dare to be fully seen. The months of subtle instruction, quiet encouragement, and deliberate guidance had coalesced into a version of myself that I could finally, almost astonishingly, recognize as whole. I remember the morning sunlight spilling across Aunt Clarissa's living room, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden rays, and the peculiar stillness in the air that always preceded the moments that changed me the most. I was standing before the mirror, the familiar reflection stretched out endlessly across the polished glass, and I could feel the tension I had carried for so long, the uncertainty, the fear, the longing, beginning to dissolve into something entirely new. It was not an instantaneous revelation, of course. Transformation, I had learned, was never about a single act or moment. It was a rhythm, a layering of choices, gestures, thoughts, and feelings that accumulated over time until the person you were becoming emerged as undeniable. I traced my fingers over the soft fabric of my blouse, down the gentle curve of my skirt, and along the smooth planes of my arms, and I realized, with a quiet astonishment, that I had grown into her vision not because I was forced, but because I had chosen, however unconsciously, to step fully into it. Aunt Clarissa entered the room then, her presence calm, deliberate, as if she had been waiting for me to acknowledge the truth myself. She didn't need to speak at first. The silence between us was enough to convey her approval, her pride, her quiet awe. And yet, when she finally did speak, her words were simple, precise, and monumental. "Look at yourself," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything we had shared. "This is who you were always meant to become." I turned slowly to the mirror, taking in every detail, the softness of my hair, the refined contours of my face, the elegance that had once felt foreign now radiating naturally from my posture, my gestures, my very being. For the first time, I felt no resistance, no fragmentation, no lingering echoes of doubt. The girl staring back at me was fully realized, and though the journey had been wrought with fear and tension, with nights spent wrestling with old habits and the boy I had been, it was real. She was me. The reflection did more than show me outward change. It revealed the interior growth that had occurred silently, invisibly. I had learned patience, resilience, attentiveness, and a kind of vulnerability that no mirror could capture, but that now emanated from every movement, every breath. I could feel the lingering traces of fear and uncertainty, yes, but they had been tempered by understanding, compassion, and the quiet power of self-acceptance. I was no longer performing for Aunt Clarissa. I was inhabiting the space fully, confidently, and authentically. There were still moments of reflection, of quiet doubt, when I wondered if the world outside would see me as I saw myself. But even those moments carried less weight than before because I knew, at last, that identity is not granted by others. It is claimed, nurtured, and lived. The lessons Aunt Clarissa had imparted, subtle and profound, were no longer crutches, but foundations. Every adjustment in posture, every careful movement of hands, every inflection of my voice had been a thread weaving me into a tapestry that was uniquely my own. The most profound realization, however, came not from the mirror or even from Aunt Clarissa's presence, but from the quiet spaces in between. The mornings I spent alone, practicing subtle gestures, the afternoons I walked outside and felt the world respond differently, the evenings where I simply allowed myself to exist in this new form without thought or self-judgment. I understood, finally, that transformation was not about perfection or compliance. It was about truth, about embracing the complexity, the fragility, and the luminosity of the self that had always existed beneath the surface. I remember one final moment before the journey fully settled into routine. I had been sitting by the window, the light soft and warm on my skin, and I caught my reflection in the glass. The girl looking back at me was calm, poised, and alive. She carried the weight of every lesson, every doubt, every moment of hesitation, but she also carried joy, pride, and an unshakable sense of self. For the first time, I smiled at her. Not the tentative, questioning smile of months before, but a full, authentic smile that acknowledged every part of the journey. And in that smile, I realized I had become not just the person Aunt Clarissa had envisioned, but the person I had always needed to be. Whole, visible, and finally, at peace. The journey did not end there, of course. Life continued with its small challenges, moments of uncertainty, and opportunities for growth. But the transformation had taken root, deeply and irrevocably. Every glance in the mirror, every subtle adjustment, every moment of reflection became a reminder that identity is fluid, resilient, and deeply personal, that guidance can illuminate what we cannot see ourselves, and that true transformation comes not from fear or expectation, but from courage, trust, and the willingness to embrace the self we were always meant to be. And as I turned back to face Aunt Clarissa, who had been watching quietly, I understood that what we had created together was more than elegance or poise. It was a bond of trust, love, and self-discovery, a shared journey that had reshaped both of us in quiet, immeasurable ways. I took a deep breath, the weight of months of uncertainty falling away, and whispered, more to myself than anyone else, I am here. I am me. I am whole. And for the first time, the reflection didn't just show me who I had become. It reflected a future I could inhabit fully, freely, and without hesitation.